Pain doesn't decide your limits. People say it lightly, but it only means something when you watch someone fight through a moment that would stop most of us cold. Pain is supposed to be the line in the sand. It's the body's warning that you've pushed too far, that it's time to pull back and protect yourself. But there are times when that warning isn't the whole story. Sometimes pain shows up early. Sometimes it lies. And sometimes it tries to convince you that you're weaker than you actually are. What makes this idea real is seeing how differently people react to the same discomfort. Two people can feel the same sharp shock in a muscle or the same burn in their lungs, and they'll make completely different choices. One might slow down without even thinking. The other keeps going, not because they enjoy the hurt, but because they've trained themselves to treat pain as information, not a command. They pause just long enough to check if something is truly broken. If not, they keep moving. Most of us never practice that kind of check. We assume the feeling is a full stop. There's also the truth that pain often shows up long before your actual limit. You might feel tired halfway through a workout when your body still has plenty left. You might feel a sharp ache during a tough moment at work or in training, and your mind jumps to the safest choice. The first wave of pain is rarely the real limit. It's the body trying to protect you before it knows what you're capable of. When people train themselves not to panic at the first uncomfortable signal, they find that most of those signals fade. What felt like a wall turns into something more like a speed bump. This matters even more when the pressure is high. When you're tired, cold, embarrassed, or scared, pain gets louder. It wants to convince you to quit early because quitting is simple. What separates strong performers from everyone else is that they've learned to make choices independent of that noise. They might feel the same pain you do, but they've built enough discipline to stay focused on the task. They know the difference between injury and discomfort because they've confronted discomfort enough times to understand its limits. People sometimes think this attitude is about being reckless or ignoring safety. It isn't. Real toughness is built on awareness. It's knowing exactly what something feels like when it's dangerous and exactly what it feels like when it's merely unpleasant. You get that awareness only by showing up consistently, doing the reps, and learning what your body can handle. Once you have that baseline, pain stops being a threat and turns into another variable you can manage. You still respect it. You still pay attention. You just don't let it dictate your decisions. Another part of this idea is mindset. Pain becomes larger or smaller depending on what you believe about it. If you think pain is a sign that you're failing, then every spike feels like proof that you should back off. If you see it as part of the process, then it loses some of its force. You still feel it, but it doesn't carry the same emotional weight. It becomes more like feedback from a training partner. Sometimes it's telling you to adjust your form. Sometimes it's telling you to tighten your focus. Sometimes it's telling you nothing except that you're in the middle of something demanding. There's also the memory of past hard things. Once you've worked through one painful moment and realized you didn't break, the next one feels less intimidating. People who perform well under pressure often rely on this catalog of experiences. They've been tired before. They've been scared before. They've been pushed to their limit before. So when pain shows up again, it doesn't shock them. They recognize it. They remember they've lived through worse. The feeling becomes familiar instead of frightening. And then there's the effect on other people. When someone works through pain responsibly and keeps going, it changes how everyone around them thinks about their own limits. It shows that the boundary they've been treating as immovable might actually be flexible. It proves that the human body and mind can go further than most of us expect. That kind of example is powerful because it's real. It doesn't come from a motivational quote. It comes from witnessing a person who refuses to let discomfort shrink them. Pain doesn't decide your limits. Pain proposes them. You decide what to accept and what to push past. Grit shows up when no one's watching. It's easy to look tough when a crowd is paying attention, when there's a finish line camera, or when you know someone will notice the extra effort. Most people can hold it together for a short burst of time if they know the moment will be seen and remembered. But grit isn't built in those moments. It comes out in quiet rooms, early mornings, and late nights when the work feels thankless and no one is there to applaud you for doing it. There's something revealing about the way people act when the pressure is low and the attention is gone. Without witnesses, you can't rely on pride to push you forward. You can't rely on someone else to pull you along or remind you of what you said you'd do. It's just you and your thoughts, which is often harder than the actual task. When no one is around, the excuses get louder. The reasons to skip something or cut a corner appear instantly. They sound reasonable, even kind. You start telling yourself you can make it up later or that today doesn't really matter. That's where grit separates itself from simple motivation. Motivation comes and goes like weather. It's loud in the beginning. It feels electric. Then it fades. Grit sits in the space where motivation disappears. It doesn't rely on inspiration. It relies on decisions. It's that small voice that says to do the thing anyway, even when you're tired, even when you've already worked a full day, even when you'd prefer almost anything else. Most people think grit is a dramatic trait, but it rarely looks dramatic. It's mostly quiet follow-through. It's the choice to honor a commitment you made to yourself, even if no one would know otherwise. You can see this difference clearly in training environments. In a group setting, some people push hard only when the instructor is nearby. They fix their posture, tighten their form, and match the pace of whoever is watching. The moment eyes shift away, they ease up. Their effort becomes inconsistent because it's tied to being observed. Others work the same whether they're at the front of the group or the back, whether anyone is watching or not. These are the people who build real, durable toughness. They're not performing. They're practicing. They're shaping themselves, not chasing approval. This shows up outside physical training too. At work, there are people who produce only when a deadline looms or when they know a supervisor will check their progress. They stay busy for appearances. Then there are the people who quietly build systems, refine ideas, and push projects forward without needing a reminder. Their discipline doesn't depend on an audience. They move things forward because they've decided that doing so matters, not because anyone will notice it happening. These are the same people who can be trusted when things go wrong, because they're already used to doing steady work in the shadows. Another part of grit that appears when no one is watching is the willingness to repeat boring tasks. Growth isn't glamorous. It involves drills, repetitions, slow practice, and long stretches where nothing seems to change. These are the moments where people are most tempted to quit or skip ahead. When you're bored or frustrated, there's no reward for sticking with it except the knowledge that you're building something inside yourself. People who lack grit usually avoid this kind of work. They want visible progress, fast results, or some sign that their effort is being recognized. People with grit understand that most real progress happens quietly and that the payoff shows up much later. There's also the matter of honesty with yourself. When no one is watching, you become the only person who can hold you accountable. If you choose to cheat the process, even in a small way, you're the only one who knows. And that matters more than it seems. Those small breaks in honesty stack up. Each time you skip a step or settle for good enough, you teach yourself that your own standards don't matter. Grit works the opposite way. It reinforces the idea that you can rely on yourself. Each time you show up fully, even when it's inconvenient, you build trust in your own word. That kind of inner trust is what carries you through harder challenges later. You can also tell a lot about a person's grit by how they deal with setbacks in those private moments. When there's no crowd to witness your frustration, it's tempting to step away and avoid trying again. It's tempting to blame circumstances or tell yourself it wasn't meant to be. People with grit treat setbacks as part of the rhythm. They adapt, reset, and continue. They may take a moment to breathe or gather themselves, but they don't turn the moment into a story about why they can't continue. They absorb it and move on. That process, repeated again and again behind closed doors, becomes the core of their strength. Grit shows up in the effort that no one claps for. It shows up in early alarms no one else hears, in extra reps no one else counts, in choices no one else will ever know about. It's built from the parts of your life that happen out of view, where only your habits and your character are left to guide you. Discipline beats comfort every time. Comfort makes a strong case for itself. It's warm, predictable, and easy to justify. It tells you you've earned a break, that you can start tomorrow, that it won't matter if you ease up just this once. Discipline doesn't make any of those promises. It's less friendly. It demands something from you in the moment instead of offering relief. and that's why it wins. It's the only one of the two that actually moves you forward. The pull of comfort usually shows up quietly. You feel a small hesitation before starting the hard part of your day. You tell yourself you need a minute to warm up. You think about checking your phone, grabbing a snack, or reorganizing something that doesn't matter. These are small detours, but they're powerful because they happen before you notice what's going on. If you don't pay attention, you follow them on autopilot. By the time you realize it, half an hour is gone. The work hasn't started, and the window for progress is smaller. Comfort works like that. It doesn't attack you head-on. It redirects you just enough to weaken your momentum. Discipline works differently. It asks for one simple action: start. Not finish perfectly, just start. It doesn't care what you feel in the moment, because it knows feelings shift around too much to trust. Discipline relies on structure. It relies on the agreement you made with yourself yesterday, not the mood you woke up with today. When you follow that agreement, even if you're tired or stressed, you build a pattern that becomes easier to repeat. That's the quiet trick of discipline. You don't need to feel strong to act strong. The action builds the strength. There's also the truth that comfort grows faster than people expect. If you give in once, it becomes easier to give in again. You start to negotiate with yourself. You shave a little off your effort. You tell yourself the standard was too high anyway. In the moment, these adjustments feel harmless, even sensible. But over time, they shift your baseline downward. Soon you're not choosing comfort for recovery. You're choosing it because the alternative feels unfamiliar. Without noticing, you start avoiding anything that requires effort. Comfort becomes the default instead of the reward. Discipline grows the same way, but in the opposite direction. Every time you choose it over comfort, you make the next choice simpler. You don't have to fight so hard to start. You don't argue with yourself as much. You stop negotiating with the plan because you've proven to yourself that sticking to it works. You begin to expect follow-through from yourself. And that expectation quietly resets your identity. You move from someone who hopes to stay consistent to someone who simply is consistent because the repeated actions built that identity from the inside out. One of the reasons discipline outperforms comfort is that discipline is tied to future you. Comfort is tied to right now you. Right now you cares about easing stress and feeling good. Future you cares about progress, strength, and opportunities that only show up after long-term effort. When the two versions of you disagree, comfort fights dirty. It uses fatigue, irritation, and boredom to make its case. Discipline fights with clarity. It reminds you that the tired feeling will pass, the irritation will fade, and the work will still matter tomorrow. Choosing discipline is choosing the version of yourself you want to meet later, not the one you happen to be right now. This shows up clearly in physical training. When a workout gets uncomfortable, you can always slow down and no one would blame you. The body even rewards you a little with a flash of relief. But that relief doesn't last. The discipline to push a little further, to finish the set or hold the pace, creates a different kind of reward, one that shows up the next time you train. You notice you're stronger. You notice you recover faster. You notice the effort that used to feel overwhelming becomes manageable. That's discipline shaping your capacity. Comfort never gives you that. It only gives you a momentary pause that keeps you exactly where you already are. In work or skill building, the same pattern repeats. Comfort tells you to wait for inspiration or energy. Discipline tells you to sit down and begin, even if the first few minutes feel clumsy. Much of good work happens after you push through that early friction. It often takes 10 or 15 minutes before your mind settles in and your focus sharpens. Comfort never lets you reach that point. It keeps you skimming the surface, doing the easy tasks instead of the meaningful ones. Discipline pulls you deeper. It gets you past the false start and into the part where actual progress happens. Another important piece is that discipline builds trust. When you follow through on your plans, you start believing yourself. When you don't, a small crack opens. If you ignore that crack, it spreads. You start doubting your own promises. You stop expecting much from yourself because history shows you won't follow through. Discipline repairs that. Each time you act on your commitment instead of your comfort, you send yourself a message that your word matters. That kind of internal trust is powerful. It makes challenges feel less intimidating because you know you won't abandon yourself halfway through. Comfort protects you from difficulty, but it also shields you from growth. Discipline exposes you to difficulty, but it also gives you the strength that comes from getting through it. One keeps you comfortable. The other keeps you capable. A broken body doesn't mean a broken will. The body has limits, and it will remind you of them in sharp, unmistakable ways. Muscles tear, joints slip, bones crack, and the pain demands attention. But the will works on a different clock. It doesn't snap the moment something physical goes wrong. It's slower to give up. It waits to see what you decide. It pays attention to your response, not the injury. That gap between what the body feels and what the mind chooses is where resilience lives. You can see this most clearly in people who've trained themselves to separate sensation from surrender. They don't ignore pain, and they don't pretend they're invincible. They simply refuse to let a physical setback define the moment. When something goes wrong, their first instinct isn't panic. It's assessment. What's actually damaged? What still works? What can be done with what's left? That mindset changes everything because it turns a sudden loss into a manageable problem instead of a full stop. They treat the body's failure as an obstacle, not a verdict. There's also the reality that willpower doesn't come from comfort. It comes from previous moments when you were tested. Anyone who's pushed through hard situations has a memory bank full of times where things hurt, things broke, or things looked impossible, but they kept going anyway. Those memories matter. They prove to you that you've operated under strain before. So when the body falters again, the will doesn't collapse. It recognizes the territory. It knows you've walked through worse. It steps forward because it has evidence that you can still move, even when your body is telling you to stop. A lot of people misunderstand what mental toughness looks like. They imagine it as someone who feels no pain or fear, who is built differently from the rest of us. That's not how it works. Mental toughness is feeling everything: the pain, the fear, the frustration, and moving anyway. It's making decisions based on purpose instead of emotion. It's understanding that your body can fire off alarms that are loud, but not final. When you've trained your will, you know how to hear those alarms without letting them dictate your next step. This isn't about recklessness. It's about control. A broken body needs care, and a strong will knows when to stop to prevent real damage. But there's a difference between stopping because the situation requires it and stopping because the discomfort scared you. The will is what draws that line. It tells you when the pain is warning and when the pain is simply noise. It tells you whether you're dealing with something dangerous or something difficult. And if it's only difficult, the will pushes you forward even if the body is screaming for the easier choice. This kind of resolve shows up in moments that look small from the outside. A runner whose ankle rolls and who chooses to limp forward instead of sitting down. A student who fails an exam and decides to study again instead of giving up the subject. A parent who's exhausted but keeps showing up for their kids. These aren't dramatic scenes. They're ordinary situations where a person proves that their will is sturdier than their circumstances. They show that you don't need perfect conditions to act. You only need a reason strong enough to keep moving. Once someone experiences that separation between body and will, it changes how they see themselves. They realize they're tougher than they thought. They realize the mind doesn't have to mirror the body's struggle. That insight sticks with them. It gives them a confidence that can't be faked. And in future challenges, that confidence becomes fuel. It tells them they've already survived moments where things hurt, cracked, or failed. So when another challenge comes, they don't crumble. They shift into problem-solving mode, because their will has been conditioned to stay alert even when the body falls behind. There's also a social element to this. When someone keeps going after something breaks, whether literally or metaphorically, it changes the way people around them behave. It raises the standard. It makes others question the limits they've been treating as fixed. They see someone operate past pain or fear, and it disrupts their assumptions about what's possible. That influence spreads quietly. One person's will becomes an example that strengthens the will of others. It creates a kind of shared resilience that doesn't depend on everything going right. A broken body doesn't mean the moment is over. It doesn't mean you're done. It means the situation has changed, and now you get to see who's in charge, the pain or the person feeling it. Leadership is proven under strain, not after it. Anyone can look composed when the pace is slow and the plan is clear. It's easy to seem steady when everything is working the way it should, but those moments don't reveal much. Real leadership shows up when the situation tilts sideways, when people are tired, when something breaks, or when the outcome suddenly looks uncertain. Strain strips away the surface layer. It shows whether someone can stay grounded when the ground under them isn't steady. You learn a lot about a person the moment pressure hits. Some people tighten up. They panic, freeze, or start looking for someone else to blame. Their confidence turns out to be thin, held up only by conditions staying comfortable. Others switch gears. They get sharper instead of scattered. They breathe slower instead of faster. They stop worrying about how they look and focus on what needs to be done right now. That shift is what separates an authority figure from an actual leader. One holds a title. The other holds steady. Strain forces decisions. It removes the luxury of thinking in circles. When stress rises, you can't debate a problem forever. You have to act in a way that stabilizes the moment or moves the group towards safety. Leaders understand that. They don't wait for a perfect plan. They scan the situation, choose the most useful next step, and do it. Even if it's not flawless, it prevents the situation from getting worse. People follow that kind of decisiveness because it gives them something to anchor to when everything else feels uncertain. There's also the matter of emotional control. Under strain, emotions spike. Fear, frustration, disappointment, and doubt all show up at once. A leader doesn't pretend they don't feel those things. They just don't let those emotions guide their actions. They respond instead of react. They choose their words carefully because they know one careless sentence can make an already tense situation spiral. People watch leaders closely when things go wrong. They take cues from tone, posture, and behavior. If the leader keeps calm, the group settles. If the leader cracks, the group fractures. Leadership under strain also involves taking responsibility instead of protecting your ego. When everything is smooth, it's easy to assign credit and look competent. But when something fails, many people disappear behind excuses. They claim they weren't informed, or it wasn't their fault, or they couldn't do anything about it. A leader does the opposite. They own the moment, even if they didn't create the problem. They take responsibility because responsibility creates control. When you accept ownership, you can act. When you dodge it, you're powerless. People trust leaders who step forward rather than sideways. Team focus becomes especially clear during stress. Some people think only of themselves when the pressure rises. They try to secure their own comfort or reputation first. Leaders think about the group. They look for who's struggling, who needs direction, and what can be done to redistribute the load. They see the entire picture instead of their own corner of it. Under strain, that perspective becomes essential because it keeps people moving together instead of splintering apart. A big part of leadership under strain is communication. In calm situations, anyone can speak clearly. In tense moments, communication becomes harder because fear shortens attention spans and stress blurs messages. A leader simplifies. They give instructions that are short, specific, and doable. They eliminate confusion instead of adding to it. They help people understand what to focus on right now, not what to worry about later. Clear communication under strain is one of the fastest ways to pull a group back into order. Another piece is consistency. Strain reveals whether someone's values and behavior are steady or conditional. Some people act confident when things are easy, but lose their integrity when pressure hits. They cut corners, abandon principles, or treat people poorly. Leaders stay themselves. Their behavior stays aligned with what they said they believed. That consistency builds long-term trust. People follow someone whose actions don't depend on the weather. Strain also exposes preparation. You can't fake readiness. When a tough moment hits, whatever habits you've built show up instantly. Leaders prepare quietly long before the crisis. They rehearse skills, learn from past mistakes, study situations, and build routines that hold up under stress. When strain arrives, they don't rely on luck. They rely on practice. And the people around them can feel that difference. What makes leadership under strain so telling is that it's raw. There's no time to polish anything. The moment squeezes out whatever is real. If someone has courage, it surfaces. If they don't, that surfaces too. And that honesty is why these moments matter. They reveal who's ready to guide others not just when things go right, but when they go wrong. The moment you think you're done, you're usually not. The mind has a way of announcing defeat long before the body reaches its actual limit. It sends warnings early, sometimes way too early, because it prioritizes safety and predictability over effort and growth. That's why the first wave of exhaustion feels bigger than it really is. You hit a point where your legs feel heavy or your focus slips, and your mind starts whispering that this is the end. But if you push a little past that first signal, you often find more strength waiting just beyond it. Most people never explore that space. They stop at the first feeling of strain because they assume discomfort is the same as depletion. The truth is, discomfort shows up far sooner. Anyone who's trained for something demanding learns this quickly. Runners discover that the first time they want to quit isn't even close to the real breaking point. Lifters notice that a set that feels impossible can still be finished with a steady breath and a few more seconds of commitment. Students realize that mental fatigue can fade if they stay with the problem instead of stepping away at the first hint of frustration. The pattern is universal. The mind hits the brakes early. There's a simple reason for that. The brain tries to protect you by conserving energy. It keeps a reserve in case things get worse. That reserve is bigger than most people think. You might reach a moment where everything feels spent, but the body still has fuel left. You just don't get access to it unless you push through the initial urge to quit. It's like a locked room that only opens when you refuse to stop. The key isn't strength. It's persistence. This doesn't mean pushing recklessly past injury or ignoring real danger. It means learning to tell the difference between genuine limits and protective signals. Real limits are sharp and specific. Protective signals are broad and emotional. One is the body saying something is wrong. The other is the mind saying it would rather not continue. Once you learn to separate the two, you stop stopping for the wrong reasons. You stop treating effort as a crisis. The moment you think you're done is often the moment right before a breakthrough. The body is warmed up. The focus is sharper. The unnecessary tension has burned off. But the mind tries to convince you to retreat because the next step requires choosing discomfort on purpose. When you lean into that step, you start discovering what you're actually capable of. It might be running another mile, holding your pace for a few more minutes, riding through the mental fog until the ideas click, or staying engaged in a tough conversation long after you want to escape. The power isn't in the grand gesture. It's in refusing to accept the first invitation to quit. You can see this clearly in anyone who's trained at a high level. They've learned that the signal to stop isn't final. They treat it as a checkpoint, not a conclusion. They pause mentally, ask themselves whether they're actually at their limit, and then choose the next action. Sometimes the answer is to keep going. Sometimes it's to adjust the pace or shift the strategy. The important part is that they don't make the choice automatically. They don't let that early, "I can't," narrate the rest of the effort. This mental discipline shows up outside physical challenges too. When you think you're done emotionally, there's often more patience left. When you think you're done learning, there's usually another angle you haven't tried. When you think you're done solving a problem, a new idea often appears if you sit with it just a little longer. Most breakthroughs happen after the moment when you feel the strongest urge to walk away. That urge is a sign that you've reached the edge of what's familiar. But what's familiar is not the same as what's possible. The idea that you're capable of more than you think changes how you approach hard moments. Instead of treating the first wave of fatigue or discouragement as defeat, you treat it as a signal that you're entering the real work. You stop expecting things to feel easy. You expect them to test you. And when the test comes, you remind yourself that the feeling of being done isn't final. It's often just the threshold before a new level of effort. There's also a confidence that grows each time you push past that first mental stop sign. You learn that you can rely on yourself. You learn that the story your mind tells under stress isn't always accurate. And that kind of self-knowledge becomes fuel for the next difficult thing. It builds a quiet certainty that even when the surface feels empty, there's often more depth waiting underneath. When you realize you're not actually done at the moment you feel done, you start living and working differently. You stop quitting early. You stop assuming your limits. You find out what's on the other side of the point where most people stop.